Hello, so welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to have Rabbi Chaim Seidler Feller back here at Valley Beit Midrash teaching virtually with our partner Temple Emanuel in Colorado. We will be learning about the biblical plagues and our plague in anthropocentric theology and a lesson for our times. And I will turn it over to Rabbi Emily Hyatt to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you so much. This is our first class that Temple Emanuel in Denver is partnering on. And I know that there are lots of people that are excited to watch this over the next week and a half of getting ready and entering into and being in our Passover holiday. I am so excited to be learning with Rabbi Chaim Seidler Feller today. And as I told him, his claim to fame with me is that I know his daughter. And so it's always nice to have intergenerational knowledge of people. Rabbi Seidler Feller is an incredible educator, and we're very, very lucky to be learning with him today. Among my favorite parts of his bio, which you can read on the website if you want all of the details, is that he's really worked a lot of his career with college students. And really, I think I know a lot of people who have learned with you and who participated in UCLA Hillel, where he was for the meat of his career, and people who really learned how to be a Jew in America and how to relate to Israel and how to relate to their own Jewish identity from Rabbi Seidler Feller and from those experiences in LA. My favorite part of his bio, things that we can only hope for, is that in 2020, there was, I don't even know if I'm saying it right because I've only ever read the word, a Fettschrift. Did I get it? It was written in his honor. When you have done amazing things in the world, sometimes people contribute to a book that talks about how the world has changed. It's called Swimming Against the Current, Reimagining Jewish Tradition in the 21st Century. And it was published in his honor, meaning that he impacted, I think, that world enough to have contributions made to the book that tells the story. And so with that, we are very lucky to be learning with you today, Rabbi, and getting us ready for Passover, for Pesach, and digging into a new perspective. So thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you, Emily. And you know, we just met, and what you said about what I tried to do in my years at UCLA was just so right on. I'm very pleased in how you read my life commitment. And the other thing I wanted to say about that introduction was that one of the editors of the volume that was published in my honor was our son. So that was an added dimension of an enormous joy and celebration, and it was a surprise on top of that. All right, so the subject at hand is a rather tough and difficult one. I do want to say one other thing before I begin, because I notice that Carl Zeth is on the call, and I just want to greet you, Carl, if I forget to greet you. We go back a long time, standing under the chuppah together a long time ago. Hello. Well, look at that, Carl and Sherry. Wonderful. All right. So greetings. It's one of the things that one of the pleasures of Zoom, the connections that you can make in this way. So the subject has bothered me, and about what some people might describe as the overzealous nature of God's punishment of the Egyptians. Was it all necessary? You know, when we were kids, we all said, "Why do we need 10?" I mean, obviously, 10 is a round number and a necessary number, but it's still, you know, over the top, especially the final plague, the Makat Bechorot. How do we understand that? The death of the firstborn, and on top of that, I'm connecting this to a discussion that was taking place at the beginning of the epidemic, the pandemic, trying to locate somehow the cause of this epidemic in violations, in the sins of the people of contemporary society. And that always offends me, that effort to know God's will, to be able to assign with definitiveness why it is that certain things are occurring, and to judge other people as a result. And this exercise was being undertaken by across religions. I mean, I sort of collected some information from the Hebrew press in Israel, from the Jewish press, from the New York Times and other articles. And you saw that ministers across the religious spectrum were all giving their opinions as to what the causes of the suffering, the divine causes of the suffering. So I'm concerned in general with this need to locate within God the cause of our suffering, which is an old effort, and in particular, how do we understand the violence that emanates from God with regard to the plagues in Egypt? So I want to start our discussion in an uncomfortable place. I mean, a lot of this discussion is not so easy, and that's the issue of reward and punishment in Judaism. Not a small matter. And if we were together and I had an opportunity to look to you, in fact, if you're willing to participate in some way and unmute yourselves, if you can, I would ask you, where is reward and punishment? Where are we confronted with reward and punishment on a daily basis? At least once, traditionally twice. Anyone venture? It's constant. I mean, it's right in front of us, and it's in a significant prayer that we recite.
Well, the Shamoa.
The Shamoa. Who's that?
Suzanne Singer. Oh, I have to change my name. Suzanne Singer. Hi.
Suzanne Singer. Not Temple Bethel, right?
No, not Temple.
Okay. No, excellent. So in the Shema, so the second paragraph of the Shema, if you abide by my commandments, then the rain will fall, and if you violate my commandments, the rain, there won't be sufficient rain, and then you'll be banished from your land. So it seems to be that if we do God's will, nature works for us. If we don't do God's will, then God has set nature to oppose us.
Except don't forget the Reform movement took that paragraph out, so I never say that paragraph.
All right. Well. All right. So I'm opposed to that to those rash movements on the grounds that the worst that there is we have a dilemma, and it seems to me that, I mean, I'm sorry to veer from the discussion, but you raised this issue of sort of erasing difficult passages. First of all, in general, I always say there's no whiteout in Scripture. It's there, and whether it's not recited, not recited, it's there on the books, and it's central to the definition of what the Shema is. Secondly, it's an opportunity for people to deal with this question. That's what we lose when we omit it, because we should confront this. After all, the doctrine of reward and punishment was a traditional doctrine, and no doubt people had a much more traditional understanding of what it meant in antiquity. So, but for us, in our sort of self-conscious understanding of what it means to be a religious person, it's extremely problematic. You do this, and then the people who are experts at identifying why this is happening to you. I mean, there are all sorts of people who do this. In fact, when authorities do that, they give license to people who are not authorities. So everybody has an opinion about why, that they can locate as to why this is happening. And what's lost, and it seems to me that's where I'm going to go. I may as well tell you where I'm going to go. What's lost is a self-examination. To what extent it's not God. To what extent is it us? And I want to be able to demonstrate to you that indeed is what the tradition really intends. I would make the claim that it intends this, all along, if we can sort of reach that point of understanding. So our first entry into the discussion of reward and punishment is a text from Maimonides. I'm going to share my screen, and let me see where we are. Here we are, and hopefully you all see the sources. Now, I do want to and I'll warn you, we're not going to be able to do all the sources that I brought you, but I'll tell you what they teach and why I brought them. And I do want to sort of present what I would say a more humanistic understanding of the function, of the importance of the plagues and what they mean. So Maimonides was troubled by this idea of reward and punishment, and in particular, he was troubled by the notion that religious people would be motivated to serve God out of the fear that they would be punished, and out of the expectation that in exchange for serving God, they would be rewarded. And I would say that he definitely saw this as an inferior form of religious commitment, despite the fact that he was aware of the fact that most people relate religiously from that point of view. People assume if I'm a religious person, then that I get benefits. And if they have a religious point of view, they're scared that from an early age, it's sort of inbred within them to fear what the consequences are of violating God's will. So Maimonides writes, and I'll read, I'm not going to read all the passages, just a few of the sections. Let no person say, behold, I perform the precepts of Torah and engage myself in the wisdom so that I will receive all the blessings described therein, or so that I will merit the life in the world to come. And I will separate myself. So in other words, you shouldn't perform God's will because of an expectation of reward. And I will separate myself from the transgressions against which the Torah gave warning, so that I will escape the curses described therein, or so that I will suffer excision from the life in the world to come. It is improper to serve the Lord in such a way. For whosoever serves God in such a way, such a person is a worshiper because of fear, which is neither the degree of the prophets nor the degree of the sages. Meaning that it's neither spiritually inspired, nor is it a rational understanding. In other words, there's no spiritual dimension to that association, nor is it rational. It is improper to serve the Lord in such a way. For whoever serves the Lord in such a way is a worshiper because of fear. Now, I would say the person serving God for these motives is not, the critique is, they're not serving God, they're serving themselves. In other words, I do what God wants me to do because I get something. I refrain because then God protects me. So it's not God that I'm serving, it's myself that I'm serving. And self-worship is a form of idolatry. I mean, so one has to be careful. Now, Maimonides doesn't go that far because in his critique, he merely says that it's not the admirable, it's not the desirable form of commitment to God. However, because he's psychologically sophisticated, he understands that it's really difficult to bring people to that level. But he goes on to say, and God should not be worshipped that way, save only by ignorant men, women, by ignorant people who are trained to worship because of fear, until their knowledge increases when they will worship because of love. Now that's really important. What Maimonides says is, look, I understand the educational process. When you have young children, you have to introduce limits. One of the ways of introducing limits is, there's a dimension of punishment that's a consequence of violating those limits. And there are some sweet crackers or sweet treats that they might get if they fulfill your will, meaning your personal will. And so too is our introduction to some training in how to into the discipline of commitment, of religious commitment. However, what Maimonides is intimating here is, even though this may be the approach with younger children, it's the responsibility of our educators to be able to elevate the understanding of people as they get older, as they educate them, and present them with a much more sophisticated understanding of religion, where you're not involved in what I might call what is it? It's a type of gas station religion. You stick in your money and you get a response immediately. It's a way of life that's transformational, not because you can recognize immediately the benefits or the punishments. But that takes time till you can reach that dimension. So in other words, what Maimonides wants is for people to aspire to an uncontingent relationship to God. It's like a relationship to the person you love. You want the person you love to understand that you're there for them, whether you get anything or not. You'll be there. Even when it costs you, you'll be there. That's the thing, right? Because you're committed. Now, in other words, and in some ways, God, this is a bit of a stretch. God allows us in our relationship with the divine to train ourselves in how to be better human beings in our relationship to one another. By developing a notion of religious commitment that's uncontingent, that's in some ways, I do the good because it's good, not because I get something for that good. That's a way of training us to be better citizens, to be better humans, to be better in our relationships with one another, where it's not all transactional, right? Do you know about transactional leadership that we've had? I mean, it can't be just about that. There needs to be some principle. How do you move people to that level of understanding? So let me see if I guess we can skip some of this. Okay. Now let's read the last paragraph. One who engages himself in the study of Torah in order to receive a reward or in order to prevent himself from being overtaken by punishment is one who studies the Torah not for its own sake. So here you see the great educator in Maimonides, but one who studies it neither because of fear nor because of reward, but because of love for the Lord of the whole earth who commanded concerning it, is one who studies it for its own sake. Therefore, when instructions are given to infants, excuse this term here, I'm sorry for the anti-feminist, Maimonidean inclination here. It's it comes from Aristotle in a way. And the ignorant in general, they should not be instructed save to worship because of fear until their knowledge will increase and they will become wise in wisdom. So in other words, the principle is, which he had articulated in a prior paragraph, is that the tradition says better that people should begin with religion as a crutch, and as they grow older, begin to derive meaning that allows them to transcend the dimension of religious actions that are only motivated by personal gain or protection, and gradually wean themselves from what in Hebrew we call lo lishma, from performance not for its own sake, and be able to reach the point where we're doing the good, as I said, because it's good. We're doing it for its own sake, rather than because we know that we're going to get something for it. Right? So that's sort of the educational trajectory that Maimonides upholds. And it demonstrates to you that although he was an elitist who made accommodations for understanding the nature of the people, and his great desire was not that he remain in the elite. His great desire was that everybody be able to embrace this worldview, a difficult worldview. But who said, religion is not so easy, I must say. Then look what he says here, and he says, they should not be instructed save to worship because of fear and they will, when this secret is revealed to them little by little, and get them acquainted with the subject slowly until they will attain and know it, when they will serve God because of love. In other words, they should gradually be weaned until the secret is clear to them, and what God desires, and they will only be committed on the grounds of love. Now, my contention here, and I know that I'm stepping out on a limb, is that when Maimonides says this secret, the real secret, the most profound secret of all, is that there really is no reward and punishment. Now, I don't know, how you say that in a religious context, But in other words, the medieval philosophers, right, were struggling with this notion. Maimonides is not the only one. Gersonides, you see this in their in the way in which they struggled. They understood that although that seems to be the baseline of religious involvement, their task is to allow people to go beyond the baseline, certainly, and to reach the goal. In other words, you should aspire to the goal, and with the knowledge that you can't always maintain that. It's difficult to maintain that, but you need to know that that's what it's about. Listen to what Maimonides says in the guide. He introduces a distinction in his philosophy that's really very useful. He says, sum up what we have said concerning beliefs as follows. In some cases, a commandment communicates a correct belief. All right. In other cases, the belief is necessary. You know what he's doing here? There are two levels of truth. There's the necessary truth, and there is the correct truth. The necessary truth is what's necessary for the people in order to be able to involve them, to attract them, to begin the process. As you educate a child, you begin the process with something that's necessary for them to be able to buy in. But when you have their buy-in, it's a violation to allow them to stay in that state where, in a way, you control them by the things you tell them because they're scared or whatever them, and you use that to manipulate. On the contrary, you should give them a sense of freedom and allow them to understand that what religion is about is then a fulfillment that's realized through them doing what's right, not what's doing what they're told to do because of their fear. Right? So the necessary opinion is a stage in the capacity that we have to develop the correct opinion. And there are many examples of Maimonides in his work in the Guide where he utilizes that distinction. And the necessary opinion is not the opinion that could be borne out philosophically as a strong representation of the truth. It's a weaker, relatively truthful, meaning it serves a purpose, but it's not the goal that we want people to attain. Now, one of what struck me as an expression of this awareness that our involvement in the world should not be on the grounds that because we do certain things, then God will be around at all times, working in nature and pulling the strings, making it rain, causing earthquakes, bringing the sunlight every morning, and so on and so forth. A striking expression is in Rabbi Koch's writings, and I'm sorry I didn't translate it. I haven't translated. I'm going to translate a few lines. So Rabbi Koch was the first chief rabbi of Palestine, appointed in 1920 by the British. He was a legal scholar of the Talmud for sure, but he was in addition a mystic, a poet, a spiritual figure who promoted a sense of inclusiveness. He made it his business to visit kibbutzim that was secular kibbutzim. In fact, there are all sorts of stories about kibbutzim maintaining a separate kitchen for Rabbi Koch's visit and so on. And he communicated to the kibbutzim that he saw them as part of the whole enterprise, that he valued who they were, right? Even though they hadn't reached the point that he would hope that they would attain. So it's a sort of Maimonidean stance of lo lishma. Even though they're doing this not for its own sake, eventually they'll attain that. All right. So it promoted. There was a degree of enormous tolerance that I think that people perceived as part of his way of thinking. So he writes as follows: Torah Yisrael here. I'm reading from this paragraph. Torah Yisrael meva'eret. The Torah of the Jews of Israel explains Now, this is really, this is a key statement. How the sustenance of the world, the existence of the world, and human morality are contingent one on the other. That's, in other words, it's not that God hovers over our natural world looking for things to do based on how we behave, but our behavior has direct impact on nature itself. I want you to think about that, because I want you to think about Vehaya and Shamoa. It says that if you don't have a disciplined way of living in the world, and you think that it's all yours to use, then you will abuse. And that's when nature won't yield its fruit. Because of you, not because God stopped it from doing so. Because you've become an abuser. So Vehaya and Shamoa is maybe one of the most relevant paragraphs, the second paragraph of the Shema, right? That we can, Deuteronomy 11, that we should read and focus our attention on today in light of a climate catastrophe, that the Torah is giving us a standard that we have to attempt to attain, which is to recognize that our ethics, our morality, the way in which we relate to others and the world around us, how we consider the world. Do we consider the world a blessing? Do we consider it a gift? Are we grateful? Do we appreciate what we have? Do we understand our existence as wondrous, that we want to hold on to? If we do that, then hopefully the world will yield, meaning the world will work. But if somehow our arrogance takes over and we see the world as serving us, and we become abusive because of the way in which we relate not only to the world but to one another. I mean, in other words, it's all intertwined. The nature of our personality and how we see ourselves, our gratefulness, our seeing ourselves as part of a whole. If we see ourselves as part of a whole, then we'll treat the whole with a degree of respect that it deserves. If we see ourselves as apart from the whole, as distinctive, different, and better than the whole, or whatever, as having more control, so on and so forth, then we will ruin the whole in the process. That's the lesson. And Rabbi Kook understood that, and look what he says. Chet Adam, the sin of a human being, kilkel bichlalo et musaro. It corrupted one's ethics. Ad shemala haaretz chamas. I mean, you can't say any more directly, because he's quoting from Genesis before the flood. The world was filled with violence, meaning human beings who were corrupted in their moral behavior. The result was that the world was filled with violence. Meaning he ruined, he destroyed the normal, the natural way of being. Now listen to this phrase. Ha'olam mitkomein aleha. The world rebels against that. Meaning nature rebels. Nature reacts. If you push nature to serve you beyond in a way that's disrespectful, that doesn't regard the process, the natural process, with a degree of what we say as a creation, as something that's been created. So with a sense of respect and the capacity to allow nature to actually do what it should do, rather than our attempt to manipulate. If we don't respect nature, it will rebel against us. I mean, I don't know whether anybody could say that any more eloquently than Rabbi Kook. And that's actually the interpretation that I'm attributing to Vehaya and Shamoa, to the second paragraph of the Shema. Now, I'm not going to read this source at all, but I think that it's evident to you that there's an understanding of idolatry. Idolatry is, in fact, a dimension of self-worship, and it's an assertion that the world is here for me and for my benefit. And I am the measure of all things. Perhaps this one line that many of us are familiar with from Philosophy 1, we can therefore appreciate the remarks of Xenophanes, a proto-monotheist living in Greece in the 6th century BCE, who said that the Ethiopian depicts their gods as snub-nosed and black, and the Thracians depict theirs as having red hair and blue eyes. And if horses could draw, they would depict theirs with a long mane, 4 legs, and a tail. And we tend to project ourselves as gods. That's what happens. And we need restraints so that that tendency that we have to assert our arrogance, our control, the fact that we're the measure, that tendency will somehow be halted, will be restrained, will be limited. Because we naturally go to that place. We rely on ourselves. It's very difficult. In other words, what I'm proposing here is that the religious personality has to look at the world with a degree of humility. That's the stance, and recognize how overwhelmingly magnificent this creation is that we've been given, and regard it with this sense of respect that won't allow them to misuse it. And the idolater doesn't have that restraint. And the idolater says, it's about me. And I can do whatever I want. And nature will continue to yield because that's the way it's been. That's how it was when I was a kid, right? They gave me a lot of sweets when I was a kid, So, that's how it happens. Now, I want to emphasize this point about our being a part of the whole rather than being apart from the whole. And I want to point you to this source, a commentary by Joseph Ibn Kaspi. Ibn Kaspi was a philosopher living in Provence. He lived in the city of Arjan, and he was a thoroughgoing Maimonidean, and he might have been, as in my reading, and I think reading what others say about him, he might have been a vegetarian, and he writes magnificently here. Let me read a little bit of what he has to say. He says as follows: besides the eradication of cruelty, so he's writing a commentary in Deuteronomy on the verse that says, if you want to take the baby birds, you have to send the mother bird away first. Besides the eradication of cruelty that the Torah wishes to make us conscious of, the Torah wishes to make us conscious of our own status, to remove pride and self-importance. I mean, wow, I can't emphasize enough the absence of education or conversation about humility in the Jewish context. I don't think we're good at it. We're good at success. We're good at being great. We're not so good at being modest. Not our leadership, not the people we honor, not what we look for, not what we look to attain. And it's a flaw in our development of our religious personalities. In our pride, we foolishly imagine that there is no kinship between us and the rest of the animal world. How much less with the plants and vegetation. This is amazing in the 14th century. To eradicate this foolish notion, God gave us certain precepts, some concerning minerals, other vegetable, other animal, and other human. Above all, we are bidden to be compassionate to all other human beings, love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the goal, right? So that's the highest standard. Next in order come our relations with the animal, which we are allowed to slaughter in an approved manner, when thy soul desires flesh, as it says in Deuteronomy, since we are originally designed to be vegetarian, as stated in Genesis. It was only after the flood that the consumption of meat became widespread, which is tantamount. What is that? Listen to this. I've never seen anything like this, which is tantamount to our eating our parent, since it is nearest to our substance. You know that when, I don't know how many of you went to yeshiva, or whatever Jewish school you went to, where they told us, they said, how could we be descendants of monkeys? Does that befit us? We're human beings. We're greater than monkeys. So Ibn Kaspi says, what are you talking about? We're related to monkeys. And he has no qualms about making this assertion. It doesn't diminish the nature of creation itself. On the contrary, it enhances, evolution enhances the notion of creation and evolving growth and creativity that emerge in the world. So there's a natural continuum between the human being and the animal world, and not only animal world here. I mean, he goes on to say, here, we can read from here, they are not so stringent again with regard, when we talk about the plant world, we are forbidden to cut down fruit trees and the like. After this comes the soil and inert matter, which is still further removed, but akin to us. And those of us who live in California know that the earth itself is alive, the rocks are alive. So there's all of creation is alive from a religious perspective, with a divine essence. It's an expression of the divine essence, of the divine vitality that's part of the world. Thus, the land itself must be rested every 7 years. To conclude, the Torah inculcates in us a sense of our modesty and lowliness, that we should be ever cognizant of the fact that we are the same stuff as the ass and the mule. I don't usually say this, the cabbage and the pomegranate. Hi, everybody, I'm a cabbage, and even the lifeless stone. So when you want to understand an educational program about dealing with nature, begin to see yourself as part of that nature, as related to that nature. And there's a continuum. There's part of us is in that. I mean, that's true, by the way, scientifically. There are elements of us in all of the world itself. And if we had that perspective, we would relate to the world, or we would have related to the world very differently from what we've done up till now, and what our attitudes are, and our continued arguments about this question. So Ben Cosby certainly sees the natural continuum between our humanity and nature itself. In other words, he's sort of augmenting what Rav Kook says, that our morality has an impact on the world itself. Now, what was Pharaoh's story? What was going on with Pharaoh? And the Torah is very explicit. What's the problem with Pharaoh, and what was the function of the plagues? So on the first level, what I would say here, this is a midrash that will illuminate some of the problem and the Pharoanic attitude, right? When we see what's happening between Israel and Egypt, then I think there's a key to understanding the confrontation. It's the confrontation between ancient paganism and an emerging notion, monotheistic idea. And the role of Israel in antiquity was what I call to be, their role was to be the dragon slayers. Their role was to defeat the empire. And the problem with the empires is that there has been no empire in history that hasn't been abusive. Also, by the way, that didn't eventually self-destruct. So the Torah sort of takes on the greatest civilization of antiquity, Egyptian civilization. We had, the question is, what was our experience there? That's another discussion. And our critique of that system is that in the pagan world, the king oftentimes, most often, asserted their right to rule as a divine right and saw themselves as divine representatives, if not the embodiment of the divine themselves. So counter to all Ibn Cosby's appeals for humility, the Pharaonic ideal was one of the Pharaonic pose, of extreme arrogance. So Moses and Aaron come to confront Pharaoh, and they say, God sent them. Pharaoh's answer is, who's this God? I checked my books. I looked, you told me his name. I looked in my books. His name does not appear. Meaning, he's not one of those gods that I know, whose attributes I know, and whom my magicians and myself can deal with. We know how to deal with all those natural forces, because the gods are expressions, they're concrete expressions of those natural forces that we worship because we want to protect ourselves out of fear, out of service, because of what we can get. I'm in charge. By the way, Pharaoh is, I'm in charge of all the gods. I can do whatever I want. In fact, most of us in Hebrew school were taught that Pharaoh never allowed anybody to see that he had sort of a natural evacuation, that he had a digestive system that worked like all human beings. He would make it his business to get to the Nile early in the morning when nobody was around to see him. And Moses caught him one morning with his pants down, literally. I mean, you have that in the Midrash sort of tells us that, you really are Pharaoh. I know who you are. You really are a human being. That's the problem. Someone who doesn't think of themselves as a human being, who actually has a sense that they're greater than everybody else, will then use everybody else, manipulate everybody else, abuse everybody else, and try to control their lives. That's the critique of the empire, the civilization. That's the cause for the rebellion. The rebellion of the slaves in Egypt was a rebellion in order to demonstrate that human freedom is something to be granted to all, and the goal is a sense of equality, as against the Pharoanic hierarchical system, where in that hierarchy, different people merit different rewards or different status, and they have rights to lord it over others. That's what the Torah wants to undermine. Now listen to this poignant conversation between Pharaoh and Moses and Aaron. He's questioning here at the end of the Midrash. You can read the whole thing on your own. He then said to them, "What deeds did God perform?" I want to know who this God is. What does he do? So then Moses and Aaron give him a whole spiel about what God has done. And then Pharaoh responds. Excuse me 1 second. I have my cursor. What's going on here? His reply to them was, "From the very outset, you have spoken falsehood." This is what Pharaoh tells Moses and Aaron. "For I am the Lord of the universe, and I have created myself and the Nile. As it says, my river is mine own, and I have made it for myself." Li Yaori in Ezekiel. Li Yaori va'ani asitani. I made it. I'm the creator. You could not have a more explicit expression of the fact that the world is about me. I'm the arbiter. I'm in charge. I'm God, and I have the right. Your God is invisible, unknowable, a nothing. And I won't abide by that nothing. The magic of the God of Israel is that God is invisible, beyond all control. That's the struggle. How do you bring people to be devoted to that which can't be proven? In order, by the way, not because you're so certain about what that God is, but because you want to avoid the consequence of what happens in the vacuum. If there's not something beyond, someone will step forward and say, "I'm the one who's beyond." God is the guarantor that no human being will arrogate to themselves the role of being God. So God becomes that's the profound lesson of our encounter in Egypt, that we need to have a sense of what the Torah calls Yirat Elohim, or Yirat Shamayim, the fear of heaven, in a constructive sense, a well-developed sense of awe, and an awareness that we're only human in the presence of the grandness of the universe, the grand nature of the universe, and the great nature of the divine. So Pharaoh rejected this. The result of this is that what happens, if Pharaoh the God sets himself up against the God of Israel and says, "I'm in charge, I control nature," so the battle of the plagues is a battle against the gods of Egypt, as it says explicitly in one of the verses in Exodus, that God says, "My fight is with the gods of Egypt." And therefore, this chart is somewhat helpful at the first level of understanding of what the role of the plagues are. The role of the plagues are to counter Pharaoh's arrogance. It's a battle against the gods, and each one of the plagues, except where it's missing here, these two here, correspond to the characteristics or the symbol of that particular god in the Egyptian pantheon. So the battle of the plagues against Pharaonic Egypt is a battle to demonstrate that God is beyond all natural forces, And the natural forces actually are part of our world that we cannot control. Only God is in charge. We can't possibly be able to determine the course of the natural world. Totally, and imagine that it's in our hands. If anybody, by the way, maybe is uncertain about that lesson, it seems to me that that was one of the central lessons of the experience, if we can talk about lessons at all, of the pandemic. We're not in control. We don't know. It's not for us to make it. We can't even control it now. That's what you're at Elohim. That phrase that's so difficult, the fear of the Lord, means we're not in control. Do you know that? If you know that, then you've learned the lesson from Egypt. The problem is that Pharaoh, not only did Pharaoh not know it, he didn't want his people to know that because he wanted the people to fear him rather than have fear for the beyond, right? And develop that sense of humility that's a consequence. So this is the first level of understanding. And again, much to say, I should point you to the fact that, by the way, that in the discourse and conversation and exchange between Pharaoh and Moses and Aaron, we actually have some hints at this very interpretation, because in one phrase, Pharaoh says to Moses and Aaron, "See, re'u ki ra'ah neged penechem." Look and see, I have made evil up against you. And Rashi intimates, although not explicitly, but Cassuto, a later biblical commentary, 20th century Italian biblical commentary who taught at the Hebrew University, Cassuto says Ra'ah actually points to Ra, which is the sun god in Egyptian religion. And what Pharaoh was saying, you guys, you're not going to be able to do anything because I'm in control here, and I know that Ra, the sun god, is going to get you. Neged, he's up against you. So the actual dialogue intimates that this is a battle about the nature of the gods and the god. And what is the power of the gods, and do they have any power at all? Right. So that's the argument on a basic level, and why these symbolic plagues represent the undoing of the natural religion of ancient Egypt, and the attempt to move towards a different understanding of religion in human life. A very difficult move. Finally, a professor of Bible at the university, at the American Jewish University, and a good friend of mine for many years, Yoni Zevit, wrote a series of articles in which he demonstrated something that's, really unlocks this entire episode. And what he demonstrates is that the plagues themselves are directly related to the creation chapter in Genesis. And that's the key. Think of this for a moment. When we talk about frogs, the verb that's used with regard to frogs is yishritzu, sheretz. Do you hear that? Those of you familiar with Genesis, yishritzu hamayim sheretz nefesh chaya, the birth of the sea animals. It says yishritzu, they'll swarm in the sea. And in Egypt, the frogs were swarming, right? You recognize darkness? Well, you know that God made a distinction between Or and Choshech. I mean, you have to think about this. So what Zevit says is not that God punished Pharaoh by bringing upon Pharaoh all these plagues, but that basically the plague narrative is a story about how Pharaoh caused the self-destruction of Egyptian civilization. In other words, he brought it down on himself. He converted creation into chaos, light into darkness, water into blood. He did it. He made life into death. And the plagues of themselves represent a judgment, an explicit judgment of the evil that emanates from the arrogance of a ruler who believes it's all about them. They will destroy human beings in the process for the sake of their power. We know people like that. Do you know people like that? Think to yourself. Have we had political leaders like that? So the think about this. The Torah is warning us. To whom do we give allegiance? In other words, it's not so simple. It's not about their economic policies. It's about character, about what people think about themselves, and to the extent to which they're willing to dominate us in such a way that has consequences for our lives. I think about what I consider to be all the unnecessary lives that were lost here in our own country. I'll get to that in a moment. In the last couple of years, unfortunately, for what? I mean, and what brought that about? So now the commentary on this page of Abraham Saba actually articulates this notion of the link between the plagues and creation. And he quotes the passage in the Zohar. You have a quasi-English translation here on the bottom, but he goes beyond that, and he says that if Pharaoh undid creation, and the story of the undoing of creation was the 10 plagues, and meaning that Pharaoh had brought the world to a state of chaos, then when Israel was freed from Egypt and came to Sinai, the 10 commandments reestablished the order, the basic foundation of human morality and human civilization, because the society was reestablished on the basis of law and a sense of limitation, which appears to be necessary. Human beings need that guidance. They need the framework in which they can struggle to attain their fulfillment, but they need that direction. So in the absence of that direction, the 10 plagues undo the 10 undo. I forgot one important component. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot tells us that the world was created by God saying 10 times, "Let it be." Vayomer Elohim hi or. Va'asara ma'amarot nivra olam. The world was created with 10 statements. Pharaoh undid the world that was created with 10 statements through the 10 plagues. The world was potentially reestablished through our embrace of the 10 commandments, which become a new road for establishing the sense of Yirat Elohim, human sense of humility, carrying into the world the feeling that we're commanded, that, in other words, that the world makes a claim on us. It's not that we dominate it. It makes a claim on us and that we're responsible as a result. That's the point. We have responsibility. Freedom means responsibility. And as God's creations, we were invested with that capacity to sustain the world and to add ourselves, to contribute to creation, to enhance creation, if we work with creation rather than against creation. 10 statements created the world, 10 plagues undid creation, 10 commandments, an attempt to reestablish an order in the universe where we understand our role in relationship to that which is beyond. Now, a person who gave expression to these ideas, this is a report, by the way, of some suffering in Egypt in a prior age. You'll see, especially the underlined parts, it refers to some period in Egyptian history where there were things that were similar to the plagues that are described in Exodus. But I want to bring to conclusion a most poignant quote from a speech that I heard Václav Havel present at UCLA. Havel was the leader of the Velvet Revolution that freed the Czechoslovakia in those days from communism, and was the first president of the Czech Republic. He was a writer, a playwright, a real spiritual personality. Listen to what he says. The communist rulers of Czechoslovakia operated according to the all or nothing principle of après nous le déluge, hoping that no one would notice. They secured absolute power by bribing the entire population with money stolen from the future generations. Miners extracting low-quality brown coal from strip mines, coal that was then burned without filters, were grateful for the chance to buy VCRs and exhausted after a day's work. It's all about economics, right? Eyes glued to the screen. They failed to notice the pus flowing from the eyes of their children. Their wives noticed. Après nous le déluge is the principle of a person who is related to no order, right? No order, but that of his own benefit. It is the nihilistic principle of a person who has forgotten he is but a part of the world and not its owner. of a person who feels no relation to eternity and styles himself master of space and time. I believe that the devastation of the environment brought about by the communist regime is a warning to all contemporary civilization. I believe you should read the message coming from our part of the world as an appeal, this is 1990, as an appeal against all those who despise the mystery of being, whether they be cynical businessmen with only the interest of their corporations at heart, or left-wing saviors high on cheap ideological utopias. Both lack something I would call a metaphysical anchor, that is, a humble respect for the whole of creation and a consciousness of our obligation to it. Rabbi Havel says this much better than I do. I mean, amazing. I may call him rabbi. Were I to encapsulate the experience in one sentence, I would formulate it as follows. If parents believe in God, their children will not need to wear gas masks to school, and their children's eyes will be free of pus. So the question becomes, do we recognize in our own recent experience with our pandemic and the plague that actually decisions were made, not only by our government, by other governments, by the Chinese especially, for their own benefit, because they were afraid of the economic consequences, to control the information regarding the plague that could have saved lives, had they been able to announce it earlier and to save face. In other words, it's a sense of my image, not the living the potential for humans to continue to live in the world. So if we learn something from the plague narrative, it's how we are completely enmeshed. We are nature and human behavior are intermingled. And what we need to do is to nurture and cultivate a sense of respect for the natural world that's somehow consistent with who we are as a human being, because it requires the development of character, a good character in relation to one another, a good character in relation to the world is the outcome of this narrative that I seek, that I want to somehow communicate. That needs to be our goal. So any questions at this time? And then hopefully we still have a few minutes and maybe we'll go over a couple of minutes. So please, if anybody has a question, I'm open to your questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for a brilliant teaching as always.
Thomas, you had a question from earlier?
I did. Yeah, it goes back to Maimonides quote at the outset. And it was that idea that we are fearful, and that's the reason why we obey, and we're afraid of the repercussions of not obeying. And I was just kind of wondering about that. And so basically you said that was kind of an inward turn. And I was thinking to some degree, you can kind of flip that around and say that fear could be that divine trace in us as well, that we're actually afraid because that's the divine element of who we are, that kind of, because you mentioned the fear of God at other moments. And I was just thinking perhaps, that's the transcendent within us that is kind of urging us to consider the prospects out there.
All right, so the point is there's two ways of looking at fear. One is the fear of punishment, whereas what you're talking about is a much more sense of awe, reverence that's linked to and an awareness of my small nature relative, and so I think you're absolutely right. And it would be wrong to simply denounce fear completely as non-productive and self-serving and so on and so forth. And that's why, I think it's so important for us to try to understand what Yirat Elohim is. Remember, Abraham has an encounter, was it with Avimelech or with Pharaoh? I forget which one he said, because why does Abraham lie about Sarah? What he says, there's no fear of God in this place, meaning you who are in charge, you political leaders, you think it all belongs to you. You'll take it. If it's my wife, you'll take it. If it's my wealth, you'll take it. Because it's all about you. So that's the degree of that needs to be uprooted. That Ein Yirat Elohim, that sense where what Pharaoh was trying to instill is a fear of Pharaoh, not a fear of God. And you're right. that's a very positive dimension of fear. Thank you.
So we have time for one more question. Lauren, you unmuted for a minute. Did you have a question or anyone else in the room?
So, all right, so I'll anybody, please, anybody with a question. I'll leave you with a little word, okay? Maimonides in his law code says that ask the question in Leviticus chapter 19, the end of the chapter, the laws of honest weights and measures is juxtaposed with a statement, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. So Maimonides asks, along with the Midrash, he quotes a Midrash, what's the relationship between leaving Egypt and having honest weights and measures? And he says that the Exodus and the redemption from Egypt was actually among other things, and because there are multiple lessons here, it was a way of instilling within people the commitment to create a just marketplace. That is, to nurture a sense of business ethics, the ethics of and the way in which we interact with one another and the way in which we do commerce with one another. Egypt was a place where commerce was controlled by the wealthy who used it as a way of holding that over the people who were less fortunate. And what we need to, and the freedom from Egypt is the attempt to create a sense of an equal plane and a society in which there was a sense of respect that was manifest in having honesty in our daily interactions. And he goes so far as to say the following, all right? If you are honest in your business dealings, if your weights and measures are straight, then you're a person who believes in the Exodus. But if you're a person who is dishonest in his dealings with other human beings, who doesn't maintain a sense of business ethics, that person denies the Exodus. That's amazing, because what he means to say is, if I can look at you, or I should be able to look at you and say, you're an Exodus person. And I should be able to tell that, not because you come to shul 3 times a day and you proclaim, I believe that God took us out of Egypt. Believing that God took you out of Egypt is senseless unless you actually embody the idea that God took you out of Egypt. To embody that idea means to pursue honest weights and measures, create justice in the social system, in the business, in business interactions. And a person who claims to be religious, but dishonest is actually desecrating the name of God. And that is a person who can't possibly carry the Exodus, the identity of the Exodus with him. All right, let's all, that should be part of our effort to try to be Exodus people, and with all the ramifications, because the lessons of the Exodus are so far-reaching. It's the foundational experience of the Jewish people. And I think we constantly have to mine that experience to try to derive what are the lessons that the Torah is trying to impart. It's not, it's not a great, if you think about it, this is the last thing I'll say, if you're trying to promote a sense of commitment to being part of the Jewish people, I don't think the best advertisement is to start off by saying, hey, you know who we are? We're a bunch of slaves who rebelled against Egypt. I don't know, that might not be the most attractive way to bring people into the conversation. Yet, at your Seder tables, you will say, Mitchila odeh avodah zarah you avotem. You'll say at the beginning, first of all, you'll say Avadim hayinu, we were slaves. And you'll also say we were once idolaters, which means we recognize our humble beginnings. And we can't come to an understanding of our relationship to others unless we say we're one of the others. We are like them. And we have to work together to bring about this change. So the lessons continue to multiply as we confront the Seder, and I'm so grateful. It's the richest tradition that I can imagine in terms of imparting meaning to our lives. So a meaningful and impactful Pesach to all of you, and see what you can get out of what you can decide that you're going to do this year to make a difference in the world.
Rabbi Chaim, thank you
Emily.
so much for your time and for everyone who could attend here either in person or virtually later during the recordings. We want to thank our partner as well, Temple Emanuel and Rabbi Emily Hyatt. And if any of you would like to learn us again, we're going to be starting back up on Thursday, April 28th with Rabbi Dr. Eugene Korn. And then there's plenty to learn from during May. We have 9 events actually, which is a packed schedule. So you can find us on valleybitmidrash.org. And wishing you all a happy and meaningful Passover.
When's Jean's presentation?
It is on Thursday, April 28th.
Ah, okay. All right.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Rabbi, thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.